Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again. This is your science teacher here, and this time I'm going to discuss the second chapter of Grade 8 Science NCERT textbook, that is Microorganisms, Friend and Foe. Students, as you can see here, this is the session plan of your chapter number 2, and in your chapter number 2, we are going to discuss all these topics here. First of all, we will discuss about its introduction. What are microorganisms? Then we will discuss about its classifications, in how many categories they are basically classified. Then we will discuss about its habitat. Then we will discuss about harmful microorganisms and friendly microorganisms. Then we will discuss about what is food preservation and what are the different methods by which we can preserve food. And lastly, we will discuss about what is nitrogen cycle and everything that you need to know about microorganisms. So let's begin. Students, when we talk about organism, all of us are included in the category of organisms. The word micro means small, rather I would say very, very small, which cannot be seen by unaided eye. So we need some kind of aid that help us to see those objects. Now the question is, what kind of aid or devices we are talking about here? Students, those devices could be a magnifying glass. As you can see here, this kind of devices is used to see little bigger objects, but in cases where the microorganisms are too small, then in that cases we use a microscope. As you can see here, this image, this is a microscope that we can use to see two little microorganisms. Now here is one important point for you, that microorganisms were first observed by Antony van Leeuwenhoek. He was the scientist who first observed microorganisms under microscope. Students, now moving on toward the next slide. Students, microorganisms are basically classified into four main categories. Those are bacteria, fungi, algae, protozoa. Students, beside these, there is one more criteria that we consider, and that is virus. Students, microorganisms are basically classified into four main categories, that are bacteria, fungi, algae, protozoa. Students, beside these, there is one more criteria that we consider, and that is virus. The basic difference between these four and virus is that virus can survive and multiply only on a living host. So it requires a plant or an organism on which it can survive and multiply. Now we will discuss each and every category in detail. So moving on towards the next slide. The first one is bacteria. Students, bacteria are single-celled organisms and they have a rigid structure. This rigid structure is due to the presence of the cell wall, and due to this cell wall, they have a rigid structure. Some bacteria are good for our bodies. They help to keep the digestive system in working order and keep harmful bacteria from it. Even some bacteria are used to make medicines and vaccines too. But bacteria can cause trouble too, as with cavities, ear infection, tummy ache, or a sore throat. Students, bacteria are different types and they are classified on the basis of their different shapes. As you can see here, the first one is cocci, second one is bacillus, third one is spirochetes, fourth one is vibrios, and last one is spirilla. These are the different forms of bacteria that are basically classified on their shapes. Now moving on towards the next slide, fungi. Students, fungi are multi-celled, non-green plant-like organism, and hence they cannot make their own food. They either live as parasites Parasites means they depend on another organism for their nourishment, or they grow on the organic matter from where they get their nourishments, like for example your bread mold. As you can see here in your figure, bread mold, penicillin, aspergillus, these are all examples of fungi. Algae. Students, algae are simple plant-like organisms which are usually aquatic in nature. That's why they are usually found in aquatic habitats, means in the damp and marshy land areas and areas where mostly waters are available. And they contain a cell wall and chlorophyll and can make their own food. Students, they have a special ability to make their own food. So that's why they are also known as autotrophic, or they also comes in the category of autotrophic. Why? Because they perform photosynthesis. Now, algae can be multicellular or unicellular in nature. They can be made up of one cell or more than one cell. And here are some examples of algae. Number one, Chlamydomonas, and the second one is Spirogara. Now, here is another category of microorganism, that is protozoa. Students, protozoa are one-celled organisms like bacteria, but they are bigger than bacteria. And protozoa have some special characteristics that make them more like plant and animal cells. Like other microorganisms, some protozoas live independently while other lives as parasites. Protozoas are generally moisture-loving microorganisms, so mostly they infected through contaminated water. And here are some examples also of protozoas, that are amoeba and paramecium. Now moving on towards the next slide. Now here is the another category of microorganisms that we consider, that is virus. Students, as I said earlier, that viruses also considered as microorganisms, but viruses are little different from the other four category of microorganisms, because viruses reproduce only inside the cells of the host organism. Now the host organism can be a plant, an animal, or a bacteria. Now students, viruses are much smaller than bacteria, and they comes in different variety of shapes and size, as you can see here. Number one, HIV virus, hepatitis virus, Ebola virus, adenovirus, influenza virus, bacteriophage. As you can see them, these are all of different shapes and different sizes. Now viruses are, as I said, viruses are much smaller than bacteria, so they can be seen under only an electron microscope because they are ultra microscopic in size. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, now the question is, where do microorganisms live, or where they basically found? Students, microorganisms are found everywhere, whether it is soil, air, water, in animals, plants, rocks, and even us, everywhere. In fact, students, our body is home to trillions of microbes, as they are found in hostile environment too, where nobody can survive, but these organisms can survive, whether they are North Pole, South Pole, desert, geysers and rocks, and in the deep sea even. Now moving on towards this next slide. Students, microorganisms plays an important role in our lives. Some of them are beneficial in many ways, whereas some others are harmful and cause many diseases. As you can see here, I have listed here some uses as well as some harmful effect of microorganisms. Students, microorganisms are used for many purposes. As you can see here, like they are used in the creation of dairy items, from bread making process, in the field of alcoholic drinks, for making medicines, for making vaccines, for increasing the soil fertility and in cleaning the environment also. Students, microorganisms are harmful in many ways too. Some of the microorganisms which causes diseases in humans, plants, and animals as well. Whereas some microorganisms spoil food and causes food poisonings. Now, students, I'm going to discuss each and every use and harmful effects of microorganism in detail. So, moving on towards the next slide. Students, first of all, we will discuss microorganism uses in creation of dairy items and bread making. Students, have you ever imagined how milk is converted into curd? Students, there is a bacteria called lactobacillus, which I have highlighted here it also, present in the milk. This lactobacillus bacteria multiplies in milk and create a chemical called lactic acid. This lactic acid convert milk into curd. In the same way, there is another microorganism called yeast that is used to make bread soft and spongy. Students, as you know that sugar is one of the basic ingredients of bread making process. So when yeast is added into bread dough, it eats the sugar and digests it and gives off CO2 gas, which causes bread to rise. Students, do you know that there is a kind of protein called gelatin present in the flour that is used to make bread? The CO2 gas bubbles expand the gelatin protein in the dough. In baking process, the gas expands more as the dough is heated. So that's how these dairy items and bread making process is processed. Students, microorganism also plays a vital role in commercial field also. Microorganisms are used for the large scale production of alcohol, wine and vinegar also. Yeast is such a microorganism that is used in baking industry to make bread, pastries and cakes because yeast helps in fermentation. Students, now the question is, what is fermentation? Students, fermentation is the process by which the yeast converts sugar into alcohol. As I already told earlier, that sugar is the basic ingredient of baking industry, and sugar is used in baking industry because yeast eats this sugar and gives off carbon dioxide gas, which causes dough to rise and thus make it soft and fluffy. Now here, Louis Pasteur was the scientist who discovered the process of fermentation in dough in 1857. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, have you ever noticed whenever you fall ill, the doctor may give you some antibiotic tablets, capsule and injections? Students, do you ever think why doctor gives us these antibiotic medicines? Students, doctor gives us these antibiotic medicines because these antibiotic medicines can kill or stop the growth of disease causing microorganisms in our body. These antibiotics cure a variety of diseases in humans, and in fact not only in humans, even in animal and plants also. Students, penicillin was the first antibiotic that was discovered in 1929, and this man over here, Alexander Fleming, was the scientist who discovered penicillin first time in 1929. Now, these antibiotics can cure a variety of diseases in humans, in plants, in animals also. Now here is a question: what precautions should be followed while taking antibiotics and why we should follow these precautions? Students, it is important to remember for you that antibiotics should be taken only on the advice of a qualified doctor. Also, you must complete the course prescribed by the doctor If you take antibiotics when not needed or in wrong doses, means in wrong way, then it may hurt, then it may make the drug less effective when you might need it in future. Also, antibiotics taken unnecessarily may kill the beneficial bacteria in the body. Means if you take antibiotics unnecessarily, then it will kill the necessary bacteria that is very important for our body, for the consumptions or for the digestion of the food. Then these antibiotics will kill that bacteria and it affects our digestion process. Students, as you can see here, there is a term vaccine. So before moving on towards the topic, first of all, it is necessary for all of you to understand that what is vaccine. Student, vaccine is a substance that is used to stimulate the production of antibodies and provide immunity against one or several diseases. Now again, here is a question that what are antibodies? Students, antibodies are the proteins that are basically manufactured by our body automatically to fight against the foreign substances. So, when a disease carrying microbe enters our body, the body produces antibodies to fight the foreign substances. The body also remember how to fight these microbes if these microbe enters again in our body. So if dead or weakened microbes are introduced in a healthy body, the body fights and kill them by producing suitable antibodies. And these antibodies remain in our body and we are protected from the disease causing microbes. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, as you know that plants require a lot of nitrogen to make proteins, but after harvesting the crops, soil becomes deficient in nitrogen. Students, you also know that there are about 78%. Students, as you also know that there are about 78% of nitrogen in our atmosphere in gaseous form, but plants can't use this gaseous nitrogen in this form. So in the soil there are certain kind of bacteria like rhizobiums. There are many kind of bacteria present in the root nodules of plants. Students, see here in this figure, these are the root nodules where the rhizobium bacteria are basically present. These rhizobium bacteria converts the gaseous nitrogen into usable form to make it easier for the plants to absorb it, and thus how these bacteria makes the soil fertile or increases the soil fertility. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, as you can see here, the heading cleaning the environment. Microorganisms or microbes plays a very vital role in cleaning our environment because these microorganisms decompose organic waste and dead remains of plants and animals into simpler substances by the process of biodegradation, and thus how they help us in getting rid of these harmful and smelly substances and clean up our surrounding environment. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, now from this slide we will discuss the harmful effects of microorganism in plants, animals and in human also. So let's start. But before moving on towards the topic, it is necessary for all of you to understand that what are pathogens. Students, pathogens are basically the disease causing microorganisms. Microorganisms that causes diseases in humans, in plants and in animals also. These all microorganisms comes in the category of pathogens. Students, these pathogens enter our body through the air we breathe, the water we drink or the food we eat. They can also get transmitted by direct contact with an infected person or carried through an animal. Some diseases that are most prevalent or most common disease that are basically caused by these pathogens are polio, cholera, mumps, rabies, malaria, etc. There are many diseases that are basically caused by these pathogens. Students, some microbes can even directly enter our body just a small cut on our skin. Just through a small cut on our skin. Students, some microbes can even directly enter our body just through a small cut on our skin. For example, here, as you can see here, this one is the Streptococcus bacteria that can enter our body just through a small cut on our skin or through an open wound in our body. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, there are some microorganisms that need a carrier, means that need a medium to transfer from one to another. So here is an example of this, that is Anopheles mosquito. Anopheles mosquito work as a carrier for the microorganism Protozoan Plasmodium vivax. Students, some microorganism needs a carrier to transmit diseases. Carrier means they need a certain kind of medium to transfer from an infected person to a healthy person. As you can see here, this is an image of an Anopheles mosquito to work as a carrier for Plasmodium vivax, the protozoan Plasmodium vivax, to transmit the disease to the host. And once this Plasmodium vivax enters in the body, the Plasmodium start destroying the red blood cells. This led to the complications such as anemia and hypoxemia. Student, hypoxemia basically is a condition when there isn't any enough oxygen in the tissues to sustain bodily functions, and thus how such kind of microorganism transmit diseases from an infected person to a healthy one. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, as I said, some microorganisms not only cause diseases in humans and plants, in fact they affect other animals too. For example, anthrax. Anthrax is such a dangerous kind of disease that affects both human as well as cattle, and this disease is basically caused by bacteria. Likewise, in the same way, foot and mouth is another dangerous disease of cattle that affect or causes death of many cattle, and it is basically caused by virus. Now moving on to the next slide. Students, microorganisms not only affect humans and animals, in fact they also affect plants. Some microorganisms cause diseases in plants such as wheat, rice, potato, sugarcane, orange, apple, and there are many fruits or vegetables that are basically affected by such kind of microorganism. And due to these microorganisms, the production or the yield of such kind of crops reduces, and these microorganisms can be controlled by the use of certain kind of chemicals or pesticide which help to kill these microorganisms which affect the yield of crops. Students, have you ever experienced that you were invited by one of your friends to a party and you ate a variety of food stuff there, and on reaching home you started vomiting and had to be taken to a hospital? The doctor said that this condition could be due to food poisoning. Now the question is, how food can become a poison? Students, food poisoning could be due to the consumption of food spoiled by some kind of microorganism like bacteria, protozoa, any kind of microorganism. Microorganisms that grow on our food sometimes produce toxic substances. These makes the food poisonous, causing serious illness and even death also. Students, so it is very important for us to preserve our food to prevent it from being spoiled. Now from the next slide you will understand what is food preservation and how can we preserve our food from being spoiled. Students, food preservation is a process by which we can preserve our edible items like fruits, vegetables, any edible items from getting spoiled. And by this we can increase the life of our food product and enable its storage and supply for a longer time. And by doing food preservation, the nutritive value, the flavor, the color of the foods remain same. There isn't any changes in our edible items. Now, from the next slide, you will learn the different ways by which you can preserve your food items. Here is the first method of food preservation, that is chemical method. Students, chemical method is the method of food preservation in which chemical preservatives are basically used, and these kind of chemical preservatives are basically used by major food industries. And why they use? Because they are harmless to humans. Sodium metabisulfate and sodium benzoate are such kind of chemical preservative that are basically used in edible items to preserve it from getting spoiled. Now, second method of food preservation is uses of common salt. Common salt is also known as sodium chloride, and it is a very good preservatives that we can use at home. Have you ever noticed your mother, your grandmother, whenever they prepare pickle, they use salt in them? Why? Because salt is a very good preservative and it helps to preserve food for a longer time. Now, moving on towards the next slide. Students, here is the next method of food preservation, that is pasteurization. Pasteurization is a process of superheating and cooling of beverages to kill pathogenic microbes in it. Students, have you ever observed your mother that your mother boiled milk before it is stored or used? Have you ever think why your mother do so? Because boiling kills many microorganisms in it. That's why your mother do so. Now, the next method of food preservation is storage and packing. Students, these days many food items, dry fruits and even vegetables are sold in sealed airtight container or packet. Why? Because it prevents the attack of microbes in it. That's why nowadays mostly food items comes in sealed airtight container to prevent them from being spoiled. Now moving on towards the next slide. Student, here is the last topic of your chapter, that is nitrogen cycle, and it is very important topic. So let's start. Students, as I said earlier also, that in our atmosphere has about 78% nitrogen gas, and nitrogen is one of the very essential constituent of all living organisms, because nitrogen is one of the basic component of proteins, chlorophyll, nucleic acid and vitamins. But the atmospheric nitrogen cannot be taken directly by plant and animals. So there are certain kind of bacteria present in the soil that helps to fix the atmospheric gaseous nitrogen into usable form. Once nitrogen is converted into these usable compounds, it can be utilized by plants from the soil through their root system. Nitrogen is then used for the synthesis of plants, proteins and other compounds as well. Animals feeding on plants get these proteins and other nitrogen compounds. But when the plants and animals die, some microorganisms like bacteria and fungi present in the soil convert these nitrogenous waste into nitrogenous compound to be used by plants again. And there was some kind of bacteria that convert some of these nitrogenous compound to nitrogen gas, which goes back into the atmosphere. As a result, the percentage of nitrogen in the atmosphere remains more or less constant. Students, this whole process of nitrogen cycle you can understand by the next slide, and this slide will help you to understand this whole process more clearly. So moving on towards the next slide. Students, this atmospheric nitrogen can be converted into usable compounds in two ways. The first one by the help of nitrogen fixing bacteria. These nitrogen fixing bacteria convert the atmospheric nitrogen into usable compounds. Student, these nitrogen fixing bacteria convert the atmospheric nitrogen gas into nitrogenous compound like nitrate or nitrites. Then these nitrites and nitrates are used by the plants from the soil. Then, as I said, when the plants die, some bacteria and the fungi present in the soil convert the nitrogenous waste into nitrogenous compound to be used by plants again. Then certain other bacteria convert some part of them to nitrogen gas. As you can see here, bacteria turn compounds of nitrogen into gaseous nitrogen again, and that's how this gaseous nitrogen again mix up with the atmospheric nitrogen, and the amount of atmospheric nitrogens remains more or less constant. The next method by which the atmospheric nitrogen can be converted into usable form is by lightning. Lightning fixes atmospheric nitrogen into compound of nitrogen in the soil. These nitrogenous compound uptake by the plants. Then these plants are consumed by animals. And as I said, when animals die, certain bacteria and the fungi convert these nitrogenous waste into again nitrogenous compound, and again some bacteria convert these nitrogen compound into nitrogenous gas, and this nitrogenous gas again mixes up with the atmospheric nitrogen, and that's how the whole atmospheric nitrogen remains constant. So students, this is all about your chapter. Now I will discuss your question and answer of this chapter in the next session. Till then, stay safe, stay home.